Okay, we thought we'd begin today with giving a little bit of background about the top two primary system and how it came to be here in California. In the fall of 2010, the California voters passed Proposition 14, which established this new top two primary system here in California. And just to give you a sense of how there are some perhaps differing viewpoints about this new system, give you a sense of what some of the proponents have to say about it and what some of the opponents have to say about it. Proponents believe that it's that Proposition 14, which led to the new top two primary, will reduce polarization of candidates, and they will have to look beyond their inherent party bases to achieve any type of status on the ballot, and then once they achieve office. Opponents, however, have said that the new top two primary system has actually weakened the field. It's actually not, no independents have been elected to state or federal office since this new top two system has been enacted, and also very few have even made it out of the primary system. So given those two set of standards, I pose the first question to you, Mr. Hoffenblum. Would you say that from the Republican perspective, the new top two primary system has been an advantage or a disadvantage?
Well, as far as on a partisan level, it's pretty much even the same. The top two. First of all, the reason the supporters of the top two put it on the ballot and urged for its passage is because they were trying to change the whole culture of those who are able to get elected. If you're a hardcore conservative or a hardcore liberal, the type of person who really complains about rhinos and Republicans in name only, are Republicrats because they're not liberal enough and progressive enough, you don't like the top two primary at all. Because under the old system, the closed primary, 80 to 90% of all the races was determined in the June primary. And if you're running as a Democrat in a very safe Democratic seat, in a primary which averaged at 24, 25, maybe 30% voter turnout, the electorate was dominated by ideologues on both sides of the issue. Now, on the closed Republican, it was a hardcore Republicans and conservatives, and on the Democrat, hardcore liberals. So the purpose of it was the hope in the top two, particularly in districts where the Democratic registration is overwhelmingly Democratic. You know, there's some districts where the Republican registration doesn't even meet 10%. And therefore, in the top two, they can't even come in second. And there are some Republican districts down in Orange County, northern San Diego County, and some of the in Empire where the same, that the Democratic base vote is so small, they can't even come number two. So what you have are same party runoffs, two Republicans versus two Democrats. And again, what is the hope on this, and it proved that, in fact, it happened in the 2012 cycle, is that the most liberal in the same party was pretty much limited to his liberal base, where the more moderate was able to go after not only Democrats, if they go two Ds, or Republican two Rs, but for crossover voters, independent and others, to be able to put together a winning coalition. So it doesn't really benefit Republicans or Democrats one way. It just depends on the ideology as to whether you want the old system, which made it predominantly hardcore conservatives and hardcore liberals getting elected, or do you want to open to the field where you get candidates that may be more represent the district as a whole and not only represent hardcore positions of both parties?
Mr. South, as a follow-up to that, Prop 14, as some observers have noted, was sold to the voters as a way to decrease the influence of parties. From your perspective, has that goal been achieved?
I would say that I don't agree with the premise of that particular reason. I have a little history with this top two primary in that in 2004, I actually put the top two primary on the ballot here in California as Proposition 62. And the legislature screwed around with this and put a diversionary measure on, which by dint of the fact it was put on as a legislative initiative, bounced up above us on the ballot and hurt us because we had the second ranking initiative on roughly the same issue, and the voters narrowly defeated Prop 62. I'm a long time believer in open primaries and in the top two primary. As a matter of fact, in 1998, I ran Governor Davis's campaign for governor. I'm the first and so far only person in California history ever to run a successful governor's race with a candidate who came out of an open primary. Now, it wasn't a top two, but It was every candidate on the ballot, anybody could vote for anybody, and then the Democratic and Republican nominees move forward. And I have two observations about the top two primary that I want to put on the table. One is that, and I agree with what Allan said, this state is so democratic and becoming more so in many ways. Republicans don't hold a single one of the statewide offices. They have only 15 of the 53 members of Congress from California. They lost their 1/3 positioning in the Senate, the Assembly in 2012, and Democrats picked up 2/3 majorities in both of those chambers for the first time since 1882. So when you have a state that is this politically dominated by one or other political parties, it means that in the general election, voters really do not have a choice. If you are a Republican who lives in a district where you have a 17% Republican registration, under the old system, if a Republican filed and ran and got the Republican nomination, that Republican would move forward to the general election as the Republican nominee. So if you're a Republican in that district, it might make you feel all nice and warm to vote for that Republican in the fall, but there's not a snowball's chance in hell that Republican was going to win that seat. What we have now is same party runoffs taking place in the fall. We had 28 of them in 2012 under the first play of the top two. 19 of those were Democrat on Democrat, and the others were Republican on Republican. Now, to some people, that's a horrible thing, because you have, let's say you're a Republican living in a district where you have 2 Democrats running in the runoff. That's a terrible thing. But the fact is, in the 2 cases of assembly members, incumbent assembly members who were defeated by other Democrats in 2012, it offered voters in those heavily Democratic districts a choice between a more liberal Democrat and a less liberal Democrat, to some degree. And a Democrat was going to win those seats no matter what happened. So the only way that voters in heavily Democratic districts or heavily Republican districts have a real choice in the fall is often going to be if you have same party runoffs that progress into the fall election. And I think that is a good thing. Forget the politicians for a minute. I think that's a good thing for the voters, because it does give voters all across the spectrum, whether you're a registered Democrat, registered Republican, whether you're a no party preference, whether you're a Green Party, Libertarian Party, doesn't matter what you are, you have the ability to vote your choice in the primary, and then the top 2 vote getters move on to the general, and you get another bite of the apple in the general election where you can choose between the 2 candidates who come out of that top 2 primary. So I think in terms of the body politic and in terms of real options for the voters, it is a good thing. Whether it will change the parties, whether it will change the nature of the candidates or not, is I think still an untold story.
My question's for Mr. Hoffenblum. So what effect will the 2-party primary system specifically have on independents or members running in third parties?
And needless to say, the third party people don't like this initiative very well. But it's not that they're squeezed out. They are on the ballot. They're on the June ballot. You can understand, because it's hard to comprehend. What we've got rid of are partisan primaries. We don't have partisan primaries. No one goes after the Republican nomination, or the Democratic nomination, or the Green Party nomination, or the Libertarian. We've abolished partisan primaries. That's why everybody goes on the same ballot, and the top 2, regardless of party preference, is the winner and goes into the November. In the past, I used to call them vanity races, particularly third parties that run for governor and attorney general. And there's this Green candidate getting a fuss right now today because there's a debate among all the candidates for Secretary of State at the Sacramento Press Club, and they didn't invite the Green Party candidate. I think that's wrong, by the way. They should invite him. But they're on the ballot. And in the past, what they would do, there'd be only one Green Party, one Libertarian, who would file, they'd automatically be on the November ballot, and they'd end up getting 3, 4, 5% of the vote. And so I don't know what purpose that was. But they do have a voice. And by the way, there's several candidates right now who are running unopposed. No one qualified to go against it. These are incumbents. And this happened in 2012. But under the new top two primary system, you know how you become a write-in candidate? All you got to do is collect 40 signatures, turn them into the county election official, and you're already declared an official write-in candidate. And if you get one vote in the June primary, you're in the top two, and you're on the November ballot. And there are many Greens and some Peace and Freedom and a couple of Libertarians who did that in 2012, and in fact, they got themselves on the November ballot, challenging an incumbent Republican or an incumbent Democrat. None of them, of course, won, but they were on the ballot. So the key thing is, what works best, partisan primaries or the open primaries? We were perceived in California as the second most dysfunctional legislature in the nation. I believe there was one that came first, that was New York. But we were perceived as totally dysfunctional under the old system where we elected nobody but pretty much left-wingers and right-wingers. Now, if you notice in 2012, people seem to be getting along a little bit better up in Sacramento, and stuff is getting done. I think it's too certain yet to see if this is really going to work, but it's going to take 3 or 4 election cycles before we really know. And as far as independents, here's the problem with the independents. They don't have a financial base as you do if you're running for Republican or Democrat. And you got all these political action committees, you got the parties themselves. Those who are out there help the candidates to raise funds. Right now, unless you could self-fund your election, actually put in your own money, the chances of you winning are slim. Though, by the way, in the past, if you wanted to run as an independent, you had to wait until after the partisan primaries and then go out and collect like 2,000 signatures, then you'll be able to get on the ballot. Now independents are on the top 2 primary ballot, and they have the equal opportunity to be among the top 2. A few did do that in 2012.
If I could comment. So one problem I have with this system, obviously it eliminates partisan primaries, as my 2 colleagues just mentioned. The way I see that is it denies people the chance to run in a heavily Democratic or Republican area, people of the opposite party. So I look at the mayor's race we had last year, where Mayor Garcetti, and Wendy Gruhl ended up in a runoff against each other. It was kind of obvious from the beginning that those 2 would be the ones in the runoff, so we ended up basically repeating the same election again. I will note that I think we had 18% voter turnout in that runoff, which is a huge problem in LA. Now, if we had partisan primaries still, we could have still had the 3rd place winner in that runoff, Kevin James, who was a Republican and who was rising as of at the time of the primary election, still in there, still giving a choice for people who are inclined towards more Republican voters. As it stood, we then ended up with 2 Democrats who, were very similar in most aspects. So that's one thing that still concerns me, is that I see it in some ways as a denial of choice to members from the opposite parties in very heavy one-party areas.
Well, a couple of comments. First of all, remember that in our municipal elections in California, both city and county level, we've had nonpartisan primaries since 1911. This is not a new thing. We have not had partisan primaries in our cities or counties since 1911, for 100 years. So the fact that Eric Garcetti and Wendy Gruhl moved on to a runoff in the LA mayor's race has absolutely nothing to do with the top 2 primary. That's a different primary system. The top 2 primary only affects candidates running for Congress in California, running for the U.S. Senate in California, and running for state office in California, meaning the Assembly, the Senate, Board of Equalization, and the 8 statewide constitutional offices. So you can't compare apples and oranges here. Secondly, there was a lot of caterwauling and gnashing of teeth by independents also in 2004 when I put this on the ballot as Prop 62. And as Allan just pointed out, this system does not automatically make it easier for independents, except that you can now run in the primary as an independent with no party affiliation whatsoever. That heretofore was not possible. You weren't even on the ballot in the primary. You had to gather signatures and petition to get on the ballot in the fall. So unlike whoever you might have been running against in the fall, if you actually got on the ballot, you were not exposed to the voters at all in the primary because your name wasn't even on the ballot. Couldn't be on the ballot because everyone on that ballot was running for a partisan primary nomination. So if you're an independent, this actually gives you the benefit of running in the primary along with everyone else, having anyone and everyone being able to vote for you, regardless of their party affiliation. And then if you finish first or second, you will automatically go on to the runoff with whoever finishes in those top two positions with you. There's, by the way, I have studied independent voters in the state for the 23 years that I've lived here. And, you know, I have people come up to me, and I'm sure you do too, Allan, and saying, you know, we now have almost 22% of the voters in California who are no party preference, who are independents, who are not registered with any political party. Do you think this is the makings of a third party? And it's kind of an idiotic question, because the reason they're not registered with the party is because they don't want to be part of a party. So you're not going to take this 22% of the electorate and turn them into a marching army to support only independent voters. They don't want to be part of a party. That's why they're registered nonpartisan. Secondly, if you look at the voting behavior of independent voters in California, which have increased from, I think, 9% in 1994 to almost 22% as of the registration that the Secretary of State put out just last week, these are not voters who just are attracted to independent candidates. These are voters who largely go either Democratic or Republican. They are not people who just vote for independent voters. So in 2012, there were a lot of Republicans and Democrats who re-registered and shed their party affiliation and ran as no party preference, as you were allowed to do in 2012. Out of 80 races for the state assembly, 20 races for the state senate, and 53 races for Congress, exactly one independent moved forward to the general election. One out of all of them that ran. And that is largely because, as Allan said, you're free to run as an independent as you want, but you're kind of a man without a country. You don't have the fundraising base that you have as a Democrat or Republican. You don't have the troops on the ground that you have as a Democrat or Republican. The labor groups on the Democratic side are suspicious of you. The right-wing groups and tax groups on the Republican side are suspicious of you. So you have no base. You have no base. So you can look at this question either theoretically, is it a good thing we have independent voters? Is it a good thing we have independent candidates? Yeah, probably. But if you look at it on a practical basis, so far, this has not proven to be a profitable way or a successful way for people to get elected to public office in California. And I would also tell you that the open primary went into effect in 2012. In the 20 years before that, there were only 3 people elected to the legislature who were not registered as a Democrat or Republican under the old system. So to somehow suggest that this new system completely freezes out independence is to ignore the history of what happened before we got the open primary.
One of the, just as a point of clarification, to follow up on your previous comment, thanks, is this new open primary only applies to statewide elected offices. So it doesn't apply to how we contribute towards electing our president in presidential election years, because federal law supersedes state law. So just a point of clarification on what we're talking about. So one of the other criticisms of the new primary system is that it puts more focus on name recognition and early fundraising much earlier in the process than it did when we had the old primary system leading into a general. So some of the criticisms that I've heard is that it's essentially taking all of the focus that would apply towards fundraising, strategizing, working with corporate consultants, gathering corporate money, taking all that and moving it much earlier in the process. So it's essentially still a two-party system, but it just is a shadow two-party system. What do you make of that criticism?
Well,
when are you going to get involved? I was going to bounce off, but it's a question that I definitely want to answer. Yeah.
There's a huge amount of money in election politics here in this state, and always has been. I mean, it's not unusual under the old system or this system and what system. You know, I've seen $5, $6, $7 million being spent on congressional races, like might on state senate races. It's not uncommon and highly competitive in November elections. You know, $1 or $2 million is spent on these assembly races. Most of it not by the candidates themselves, but all these independent expenditure committees, you know, PACs and you know, all this. You know, a lot of comment on Citizens United, this U.S. Supreme Court ruling that opened up easier abilities for businesses and labor unions to get more involved in politics. Well, in this state, they've been involved for a long, long, long time. The two-party system, it basically it opens up. More people are getting involved less people get involved in the funding of these open primaries, because they know all they have to do is come in first or second. In the past, if you were a safe Democratic seat and you had a Labor Democrat and a pro-business Democrat running against each other, both the business PACs did everything they can, spending millions before the pro-business person, and the Labor Union spent $1 million trying to elect the pro-Labor Democrat. And by the way, Labor was much more successful in the closed primaries because pro-Labor tended to be also more progressive within the Democratic Party. And the same thing was true in some of the Republicans. Now that they know that they're going to be in the top two, they're not spending as fiercely as they in the primaries they did in the past, because they know they need the money in the November elections. But it pretty comes down to is, who do you want to have the power? Those who give money, increased by those who give the money, the political parties, or do you want the voters to really have the party? The two-party system gives more power to a whole array of voters in selecting who they're going to choose, regardless of how much money is being spent in that election. So money's always been there, always will be, but this is a system that gives more power to the voters to determine who is going to be elected, rather than partisans in both parties in the June primary.
Jordyn and Sam, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I want to follow up on Gary's point about independence, and it's sort of relating to another question you have here, but I think there's a unique opportunity for Republicans in the state with the top two primary system. You know, the Republican name in California statewide is pretty bad, let's be honest, and in certain districts it's really bad. And I want to use the example of that independent making it past. I think it was Henry Waxman's district, and he was running against Bill Bloomfield. Bill Bloomfield was formerly a Republican, a very moderate Republican, but still a Republican, and he knew in that district he could not win as a Republican, so he changed his registration to independent. And Henry Waxman was a very wealthy, well-funded, entrenched incumbent. It's going to be very hard to beat him. But Bill Bloomfield actually got 46% to Henry Waxman, and Henry Waxman's been there for years. I mean, that's really impressive. So if we could get moderate Republicans to change their registration to independent, especially in statewide offices, it could make a difference. Because you could play the card of, oh, well, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, I'm coming from the middle. And I think a lot of voters tend to like that. And we're going to see this play out statewide with Dan Schnur, our own Dan Schnur. And I think it could really do a great deal for Republicans.
Let me comment on that.
And then I want to comment on it.
First of all, I kind of agree with him. I mean, the California Republican Party is no longer a statewide party. I'm going to be very honest. I've been involved in Republican politics for 40 years. I remember when Republicans running for president could carry California, Republicans running for governor could carry California. In fact, in the 20th century, the entire 20th century, there was only 3 Democratic governors in California. I'm not counting Gray because he came in about 2 years before the end of the century. but 3, and 2 were named Brown. And the new registration figures just came out, and we're down to 28% Republican statewide. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor, registration was like 34-35%. Not even Arnold, pre-Governor Arnold, could get elected governor in this state, statewide right now. If the Republican Party isn't able to do something about their brand and able to turn it around and expand their voter base, what you're going to see, in my opinion, one of 2 things. We're going to have 2 Democrats running against each other for governor and secretary of state and lieutenant governor stuff, probably in 2016, or someone like a Bill Bloomfield, who is a more moderate, less ideological Republican, leaning Republican, is going to start running as an NPP for governor, attorney general, and from the statewide races. And that then will generate others running for Congress and the state legislature to maybe themselves start running as an NPP, because they will be identified with a statewide candidate. Something has to replace the vacuum of not having a Republican Party in this state. The Democrats, you can't have a one-party state. It's too large. It's too diverse. This isn't Connecticut. This isn't Hawaii. And if the Republican Party can't get their act back together, there may be some avenues of people going through the NPP to give it some validity.
One comment about people filing and running as no-party preference candidates. One of the factors that we ran into in 2012 was candidates like Bloomfield who made a political decision that they would rather run as a nonpartisan than a Democrat or Republican. But they still had a party history with one of the two major parties. And voters are very suspicious, I think, of someone who switches their party registration at the last minute, just based on a political calculation that it will be easier to run and easier to win in a particular district as a no-party preference candidate than as a registered Democrat or registered Republican. In the case of Bloomfield, he spent $7 million in that congressional race, in one congressional race out of 53. He did do relatively well, 47% of the vote, but spent $7 million to get there. But there were many voters, and I live in that district, so there are many voters who looked at him and said, well, wait a minute. How can this guy be an independent when he's had all this history of giving to Republicans and giving to Republican candidates and giving to Republican entities? So candidates are going to have to be very careful under this new system that they don't try to basically fool the voters by switching to no party preference at the last minute, just before they run, when they have a long history of being registered with one of the major parties or the other, and have a history of giving candidates of those parties money, and being involved in causes that are identified with one of the two major parties. Voters are highly suspicious of candidates who do that sort of thing, and I could go back and cite several instances of this that occurred in 2012, where no party preference candidates were rejected by voters because it became clear during the course of the campaign that they were just trying to hide their identity as a longtime Republican or longtime Democrat. That's tomfoolery, and voters are not going to buy that. I think for an independent to actually make this work and pull it off, it's going to have to be somebody who has been a fairly long time independent voter who's not been registered with one of the two major parties, so that it's not just a crass political decision made on a political calculation that it might be easier to run as a no party preference candidate.
Just one concluding remark. My new target book just came out with all the candidates on the June primary. There are 497 candidates running in the June primary. Only 25 are running as no party preference. All the others are running on a party label. So it's not very fashionable yet to run as a no party preference.
And just as an addendum to what Garry said, and to Allan's original point, I'm curious to see if incumbents now looking to run in 2016, given the impact of term limits and the somewhat musical chairs effect we have in California at our statewide level offices, how they will get past their strong partisan history. So you look at someone like Gavin Newsom, who clearly has ambitions for higher office, whether that be Senate or governor. How is he going to get past his history of being a Democratic activist to appeal to the moderates that he's going to need to if it ends up being a Democrat on Democrat primary, which, as Allan pointed out, given the 28% registration of Republicans in the state, is highly likely if Gavin runs for governor.
So we've reached the midpoint of the hour, which is the point at which we ask for questions from all of you to any of our panelists. Do we have any questions? Also, please tell us your name and your major if you're a student. And please remember, if you address your question to someone with whom you disagree, that we can disagree without being disagreeable.
My name is Ashlyn. I'm a senior in Dornsife, political science major. I had a question for Garry South. Oftentimes in class we'll be told, remember, you're in political science student at a very high university, think about the common constituents. You made the point just a minute ago that you think that people would not be fooled by the fact that you're just switching to independent all of a sudden. How do you think that will really be a big deal with the normal constituents that aren't very engrossed within the political science dialogue and what's been going on in past elections?
Well, it's a good question, but remember that
Let's repeat the question just in case anyone didn't hear it.
her comment was, "This is the most brilliant discussion I've ever heard about." No. Her question was, will it really matter to the average, relatively uninvolved person whether or not somebody has switched their party affiliation at the last minute? Is that the thrust of it? Well, I think the answer is it will depend, but let me just point this out. Even though we now have open primaries and top two primaries, our primaries still, even the one in 2012 where we had the first open primary, our turnouts are very low in the primaries. And mostly what you have turning out in those primary elections are hardcore Democrats and hardcore Republicans, which is part of the reason we moved to the top two primary, because these were the people who were electing in these very non-competitive seats we had, that were electing people in the primary, pushing them forward, who automatically got a bye essentially in the fall election. So yeah, it will matter to a lot of partisan voters in the primary who tend to be your high turnout, hardcore Democrats, your high turnout, hardcore Republicans. It will matter to a lot of them that someone has done a switch at the last minute and veered away from their longtime party affiliation to become a nonpartisan. These are our open primaries, and even in the one in 1998, where Governor Davis was elected, it has not been shown to really drastically increase turnout in the primaries. And so what you have is relatively low turnouts, 30%, 35%, and those voters tend to be the hardcore voters on both sides. They do not tend to be unaffiliated, uninvolved, disinterested independent voters. So yeah, those partisan voters will care. Many of them will care that someone is trying to basically put a mask on their face and say, I'm an independent, when for 25 years they've been a registered Republican or a registered Democrat.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Daniel Haas. I'm a sophomore political science and economics major. One of our professors at USC did a study for the Schwarzenegger Institute to analyze whether or not the top two primary would lead to the election of candidates that are willing to vote more moderately, which I think is sort of the whole endpoint of the law. So I guess it's fitting to ask the students on the panel, do you think that the law will make candidates more moderate, and do you think that it will cause them, once they've been elected, to vote for legislation that is more moderate, or to at least reduce the gridlock that has plagued the legislature for years?
I think it depends on the district, and it depends on the election. So, for example, my home district, the 46th congressional district, or excuse me, the 48th congressional district, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, he's getting challenged by a moderate Republican, Wendy Lease. She's a Costa Mesa City Councilwoman. I think he'll definitely beat her, A, because a healthy Democrat is running and the Democrats will vote for her, and B, he has the power of incumbency. But as we go further along, I think you will see more moderate candidates elected in these either very conservative or very liberal districts. So essentially the unique thing about this, it can hurt both Republicans and Democrats. I think it hurts both conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats.
Let me just ask, do you want this answer to the state assembly level, or do you want it about Congress?
Yeah, the state assembly.
Okay, so on the assembly level, one thing we do have to contend with here is term limits and how it flips over so quickly. So yes, this will make people more moderate. Will it lead to greater effectiveness? I don't know. The term limits part, and this is where this comes in, means there's a lack of institutional experience in there, which is going to be a hindrance regardless of whether you have the most liberal new assembly member, or you have the most conservative new assembly member, or you have someone straight down the middle. So that's one thing to consider. In terms of Congress, I do think it will increase moderate members eventually. Whether that will have an impact, again, you're one of 435 members in Congress. I know JFK kind of famously said they treat us like worms when we get here, and that's the level of impact they have. So whether it will impact Congress as a whole, I don't know. The California delegation will definitely change, in my opinion. Whether that will have an effect in Congress, we can only hope so.
Can I address this? Well, we have some instances in 2012 under the top two that are kind of illustrative, I think, for this purpose. I can't tell you that overall the top two is going to make the legislature more moderate or make the California congressional delegation more moderate, but there were three pretty high-profile cases in 2012 where an incumbent Democrat who'd been there for a long time faced another Democrat in the fall. Congressman Pete Stark, up in the San Rafael area, up near San Francisco, who'd been there for 40-some years, got into a runoff with a young Democrat named Eric Swalwell. This is a heavily Democratic seat where if Pete Stark had not had a Democratic opponent in the general runoff, he could have stayed there until they carted him out of Congress on a gurney. But what happened was, he came in first in the open primary. Eric Swalwell, who was a city councilman in one of the cities in that district, came in second, a fairly distant second. And so everyone thinks, well, you know, Pete Stark's up to his old tricks, he's going to win again. on and on and on. But what happened in the general election was, because Pete Stark was really a very extreme liberal in many ways, and by the way, an atheist as well, for whatever that's worth, self-professed atheist, and was a prick to begin on the third point. In the general election, where you have everyone voting, Republicans, Independents, Green Party, Libertarian, Moderates, Conservatives, everything else, Eric Swalwell passed him in the general election and beat him. Okay? In the assembly, you had a seat up in the north part of the state, the 10th Assembly District, where Mike Allan, who was an incumbent, fairly traditional liberal Democrat, and in the 50th district in Santa Monica, where I used to live, where you had Betsy Butler, who was an incumbent, very liberal member of the legislature, who got into same party runoffs in the fall against more moderate Democrats. Okay, so even though they were incumbents and had the full support of the Democratic Assembly caucus, they got beat in the runoff. And in both cases, just like with Pete Stark, those incumbents came in first in the primary. Their opponent came in second. And then when the field was cleared out and it went on to the general election with much higher turnout, much more representative turnout, much more moderate turnout, they got beat too. So I'm not saying this is a pattern that's going to persist in every single race where you have an incumbent going off against somebody in their own party in the fall. But those are three pretty high-profile cases that tell you that if you don't adjust your positioning to the fact that in a general election you may have someone of your own party to the middle side of you, to the moderate side of you, you could get your rear end beat. And that's what both parties' incumbents are going to have to get through their heads. This is no longer a matter of sewing up the party nomination in a very low turnout primary and then going to Hawaii for 7 months. Okay? They're going to have to be looking over their shoulder constantly at younger, more attractive, more perhaps moderate members of their party who don't even have to beat them in the primary. They only have to come in second in the primary, and it could be a distant second in the primary, and then they're off to the races in the fall, where every voter is in play. That's what happened to Pete Stark, that's what happened to Mike Allan, and that's what happened to Betsy Butler. And in my mind, that's a good thing. I think incumbents should have to be looking over their shoulder constantly to say, am I really representing this district in a faithful and diligent kind of way, or have I gotten fat and happy, and have I gotten too far off to the left, too far off to the right, where somebody could get into a primary, come in second to me even, and then go off to the general election with a much larger, much more representative, much broader electorate, and kick my rear end. That's a good thing in my mind. And I would say that whether I was a Democrat or Republican.
We have Tom McClintock seeking re-election up in Northern California. Many of you might know who Tom is. He used to be a state senator in Ventura County, ran for governor in the Davis recall election. He's a hardcore conservative, Tea Party type Republican. He moved from Ventura up to Placer to run for Congress when the seat became open. And because of his high name ID and likability among hardcore conservatives, he won the seat. He's very hardcore Tea Party, and many people up there are very concerned because he's the type that won't bring any money back from Washington to help with their roads and help their highways and the things they kind of like to see get done since they're paying taxes. Can't we get some of it back? Well, he's going to be running against a Republican in November because on the ballot are 2 Republicans and a totally unknown no party preference candidate. And this is and his name is, Moore, something Moore. And he's a West Point graduate, tied into, law enforcement and what have you. And we're going to see, this is going to be, we've been reading a lot about how these Tea Parties are challenging these so-called rhino U.S. senators across the country. Here's a case where it's a more moderate. By the way, you've got to be honest. I don't like the word moderate. I don't know what that means. In the Bay Area, San Francisco, they're still going to elect liberal Democrats. In Orange County, they're going to elect conservative Republicans. In the Inland Empire, they're going to elect conservatives. The west side of LA, they're going to elect liberals. The point is, maybe there'll be more representative district as a whole and not trying to be so ideologically pure. I think that's what the 2 parties are all about. And the guy running against Tom McClintock is no liberal. but he's not dogmatic, and it's going to be interesting to see how the Democrats and Independents handle it when he's up in November. So we'll stop it at that.
Yeah, I think a big key in those kind of races are having healthy Democrats or healthy Republicans run, even though they're going to lose in the general. I mean, we did see this play out in 2012. Again, my assembly district, Alan Mansour was challenged by a more moderate Leslie Tygh, who was a Newport Beach City Councilwoman. But there was a healthy Democrat running in that primary, and he went on, so the Democrats voted for him in the general, obviously, and Alan Mansour won. So I think the big key is having a healthy member of the opposing party.
Any other questions? Yes.
So I'm Alec White. I'm a sophomore political science major, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on what happened in California's 31st district in 2012, where it was a Democratic-leading district, but about 4 or 5 Democrats ran, and 2 Republicans ran, and 2 Republicans advanced to the top 2.
Well, that will happen, and it did happen in the 31st. Democrats will win that seat back, however, in 2014, there's no doubt about it. Gary Miller, who was the Republican who snuck through there, is not a good fit for that district. It's a Democratic district. It's heavily minority. He's a Tea Party Republican. He's actually not running again. He understood that the handwriting was on the wall. There are going to be anomalies in this system that you will see, and 31st was certainly one of those anomalies. But I would point out to you too that I mentioned Pete Stark, the long-term congressman who got beat by a Democrat in the runoff up north. There were actually 4 Democratic incumbent members of Congress who got beat in 2012. 4 of them, not just one. Laura Richardson got beat down in the Long Beach area. Joe Baca got beat out in the Inland Empire. And Howard Berman got beat in the San Fernando Valley. And in all 4 cases, they did not get beat by a Republican, they got beat by another Democrat. There were also 4 sitting Republican members who got beat by Democrats as well. So the turnover that this provided, and by the way, to put it in context, from 2002, after the 2000 census and after the seats were redrawn for the 2002 elections, until 2012, that 10-year period of time, we have 53 members of Congress in California, 53, the biggest delegation of any state by far. Exactly 1 congressional seat had an incumbent defeated. In all 53 seats over 10 years, that's 5 elections. Do the math. In 2012, 4 Republicans went down and 4 Democrats went down. 8 members of Congress defeated in 2012. And partly that was because of the redrawing of the lines with the Citizens Redistricting Commission, which also was a factor that plays into this. But part of it also was the top 2 primary. If Pete Stark had drawn a Republican opponent, if Joe Baca had drawn a Republican opponent, if Laura Richardson had a Republican opponent, if Howard Berman had a Republican opponent, none of the 4 of them would have been beaten in those seats. None of them would have been beaten. So, you know, you can argue about whether it's a good thing that members of Congress get beat. I think occasionally it is a good thing. But if you look at the 10 years of stasis in between 2002 and 2012, where out of 53 members of Congress, 5 election periods, one member of Congress got beat in California, versus 2012, where 8 of them got beat, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and the 4 Democrats all were defeated because of the top 2 primary. In my estimation, that is a good, healthy thing in the political system to make sure that these people are on their toes and they understand that they're not there for life, and it's not a lifetime judgeship appointment to go to Congress.
Let me tell you about the 31st. What you had, and he said, Gary Miller was a congressman from portion of Orange County, LA County, and they thought he was going to have to run against Ed Royce for Congress. They were put in the same district in reinforcement, who is now the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee. And Democratic leadership back there did not want to see a Miller-Royce race, so they conned Gary Miller to pack up his bags and move into the district that used to be, a lot of it was Joe Baca, and a lot of it was Jerry Lewis. In fact, when Jerry Lewis announced that he wasn't seeking re-election in 2012, that's what motivated Miller to go in. But then he had to go against the former Senate Republican leader, who had planned and he stayed in the race. Fred Aguiar was the Democrat. He's a councilman from one of those local cities there, Redlands, I think, or one of them, I'm not quite sure. And the key to that district was the turnout of the Latino vote. In the June 2012 primary, Latinos stayed home. They were not motivated to go vote. Fred had another Democrat who was also Latino. The Latino vote was very weak, it was split. And as a result, the two Republicans came out. It was an anomaly. And of course the Latinos did come out in November, but then it was too late. Right now there are, again, there's about three or four Democrats running and 2 Republicans running in the open seat. Fred Aguiar is again the favorite of the DCCC, but there's a Latina lawyer who's been endorsed by Emily's list and is working very hard in that race also. My gut tells me, because the 2 Republicans are battling each other and throwing mud at each other, that Fred Aguiar, you will have a D on the ballot this time, and that D will be elected to Congress in that district because it's overwhelmingly Democratic in registration.
One thing I just want to add, that as a campaign strategy note, this is an interesting example, and not just the 31st, but I look right now at the Secretary of State race that we have, where Leland Yee, for his evening activities, shall we say, just dropped out of the race. Is that a good thing or not, depending on how you look at it? For Alex Padilla, who's the leading candidate, it's a great thing. He doesn't have a Democratic split in his votes now. He can coalesce his base. For Dan Schnur, I don't think it's as much a good thing, and we'll see if my colleagues here agree. So as a strategy note, it's an interesting question. Can you prop up another Democrat or another Republican in a race to split the vote and help your candidate advance? We'll see if that happens.
An interesting race was Rob Wright, who, by the way, has been thrown in with the other 2 because he falsely said what his residence was. But he's up for re-election 2012. And it's a district that went from, San Pedro to Watts or what have you. It was a new district. And a Democrat filed, it was one that the Republican registration was like 10 or 11%. And Ron Wright is a favorite among the business community. They perceive him as being a more pro-business moderate Democrat up there. As a side note, what's interesting, when business is looking for Democrats, tend to be the candidates of color, African Americans, Latinos, seem to be much more susceptible, to business issues than some of the more liberal white legislators. But anyway, this Democrat entered the race. He was a community organizer, and they were very fearful that, in fact, it would have a 2-party runoff. There was a Republican on the ballot, and they spent like $600,000 to get the maximum Republican vote they got because they wanted a Republican vote against Rod Wright rather than a fellow Democrat. And you're seeing that quite a bit. There's races where, now on the Secretary of State race, I think Peterson's going to be in the top 2 because there's a sufficient Republican base. I think he'll get enough votes to be probably within the top 2. Then it goes back to an R versus D race. And but a lot of games are played, on the top 2 now. And there's a lot of games being played up there with the campaign against Mike Honda and this Ro Khanna, an Indian American who's raised about $2 million. And all of a sudden, this is a district that's 17% Republican. And all of a sudden, we got another Indian American, a female physician, who is spending like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I don't know where that money's coming from, but I'm sure pretty much, the Honda people behind, hoping that a Republican gets sufficient vote that there won't be a 2-party runoff. But a lot of games are played into this new system as the consultants learn, different techniques. So all your political scientists can, watch some of these campaigns because this is brand new to the consultants too.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, I think I'll just ask one as a follow-up and then we'll wrap up our discussion. Another aspect of campaigning that we haven't really talked about is some of the tangential actors, if you will, the consultants, as you mentioned a moment ago, Allan, seeking endorsements, seeking editorial review board endorsements from the papers. Talk a little bit about how all of that process moves up in a new open primary. Whereas before a candidate would go to an LA Times review board, let's say, or Sacramento Bee, they'd seek out labor endorsements, they seek out other incumbents endorsements, they do that later in the process. Talk about the effects of going at that a little bit earlier in the process?
Well, I find out a lot of papers are making dual endorsements, but those both Republican and a Democrat tell the voters, this is what the best Democrat, the best Republican. Sacramento Bee does that. The LA Times has done it a couple of times. But I don't think the idea of endorsements, editorial boards, that's not going to change. I mean, maybe the timing of it changes as to whether for example, there's a lot of races where there's already only one Dem and one Rep on the ballot, and everybody knows that very little action is going to go in the June primary, and they're all going to wait until the fall campaign because they already know who the November candidates are going to be. But obviously, if you got 10 Democrats and 14 Republicans all running for the same seat, the newspapers and the editorials and what have you, get involved a little bit earlier. One of the easiest things, by the way, that determines one's politics is going to see who is endorsing the different candidates. If I'm going through with the target book and we list all the endorsements, and I see they're endorsed by the California Nurses Association, that there means they're a progressive Democrat who believes in a single-payer plan. If they're endorsed by Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, it's a hardcore conservative who has promised to do nothing to do any harm to Proposition 13. If you get endorsed by the California Labor Federation, they're a labor Democrat. They get endorsed by the California Chamber of Commerce, they're a pro-business Democrat. So the endorsements, by the way, are what really, particularly with candidates you don't know, get a general idea as to what their political philosophy is. Because all these candidates get swarmed with these questionnaires from the different groups, the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, the California Labor Federation, Equality California. All of these groups send these letters and questionnaires. And they return them based on their endorsement. If you get the endorsement, you pretty much guess how they answer those questions. But I don't think the top two has any serious impact on that other than maybe the timing.
I would agree with that. And I guess I don't quite accept the premise that the top two has moved this whole process back. I ran Gray Davis's campaign for lieutenant governor in '94. We knew in '95 he was going to run for governor in '98. We started our campaign. He was elected in '98. We started fundraising in the first month of 1999 to run for re-election in 2002. I mean, this process in America, this is a bizarre process to the British, who have these 6-week campaigns, to figure out who the prime minister is going to be. But our campaign process is much longer. And remember that when I speak to college groups outside of California, one of the things I point out is that the sheer size of California, the sheer magnitude of this state. We all know it's the biggest state, but I mean political magnitude of the state is immense. We have more registered voters in this state than there are people living in 46 of the other 49 states. Populations. LA County, where we're now sitting, is itself bigger than 42 states. So if you're a county supervisor in LA County, you represent a geopolitical district that is bigger than that represented by 84 United States senators sitting in Washington. Every single one of our 40 Senate districts is bigger than my home state of Montana. It's immense, and so people can bemoan money in politics and how long people run their campaigns and all of that, but the fact is it's just a reality of the state in which we're living. This is a very big state. It is very expensive to run for office here, and nothing you're going to do artificially, trying to shorten the campaign season, trying to put campaign contribution limits on, which we already have, nothing is going to stop the fact that it's an immensely big state and a very expensive state in which to run for public office. That's just a reality we have to deal with.
On the note of endorsements, I think we are going to see people be a lot more judicious once elected and looking for re-election about which endorsements they want. So if you think about a scorecard, which is when an organization rates a legislator based on their votes, and how they support a specific issue. If you're a conservative, where previously you want to get an A from the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, because you need to prove your conservative bona fides in the primary, in a Republican primary, that would be great. Now, of course, you have to appeal to moderates, and you might have someone more moderate running against you rather than someone running to your right flank. So are you going to want that Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association endorsement, or are you going to want something more moderate to appeal to people? So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to see, and Allan alluded to this, is a little bit more judiciousness in people in what endorsements they go after.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on endorsements as well. The Berman-Sherman race, I think it was very interesting. Sherman was actually endorsed by Congressman Rohrabacher and Michael Reagan, who's the son of President Ronald Reagan. And he went on to win. He got more Republican votes in that election. So I think when you have these top twos in the general elections with two party members going after each other, they really should court endorsements from people of the opposite party.
I'm going to disagree with you just on that Berman-Sherman race. Nobody thought Sherman was going to defeat Berman. Nobody did, because of the Berman-Waxman machine and the consultant, Michael Berman, his brother, and what have you. Here's a mistake I think Howard Berman made. Actually, Howard Berman got some very key endorsements from powerful Republicans, Senator McCain and Lindsey Graham and Darrell Issa. Now you got to remember, Howard Berman was running in a congressional district where over 80% of it was Sherman's district. Sherman was well known. People didn't know who Howard Berman was in the district. But all of a sudden they started hearing the Berman people, who I have gone against many times, both winning and losing, going against them. But they shouted, Howard Berman shouted that they had endorsed all these Republicans. Now, you're a progressive Democrat or some partisan Democrat. You don't know that much about Howard Berman, except he's been endorsed by Darrell Issa. Are you going to vote for a guy endorsed by Darrell Issa? In the past, what they should have done is kept it secret, pinpoint mailings that they were good for, send them right to the Republicans, and don't get on the highest ballot top and tell them that all these right-wing Republicans that you don't like are supporting one of the two Democrats. So I think that was a very, very bad tactical error on their part and contribute to Sherman's election. I didn't know those two people endorsed Sherman.
Yeah.
But I do know who George Borman.
It's 1 o'clock, I'm sorry.
Okay.
As you can see, the discussion could go on for hours, and thank you all for a very spirited discussion, but we do need to wrap it up. Just as a reminder, if any of you are interested, we are hosting this Saturday a Young Women's Political and Civic Leadership program from 8:45 a.m. to 3 p.m. If you'd like to nominate a high school woman, a young woman to attend or volunteer at the event, please contact Laura Hill in our department and she'd be happy to give you the information. Also on your seats today, we've given you a little subtle reminder to please register to vote if you intend to vote in the primary, the open jungle primary this June 3rd. So please make sure you're registered to vote. And as I mentioned at the top of the program, this is our last lunch discussion for this semester. So we will look forward to seeing you in the fall on September 10th. So thank you once again for joining us, and please give us a warm welcome for our panelists. Thank you to our panelists.